wir? Ich kann's nicht lesen. Egal. Schnell, zurück! Sie kommen!
The hedgerows are holding us back. We're taking heavy losses.
We have to break through here, before the Tommies arrive.
Send the panzers wide, around this position.
Take cover, quickly! Move, move! Get to the bunker!
July 25th, 1944. Normandy, just beyond the hedgerows south of St. Lo. Dawn has not fully arrived. The air is heavy with damp earth and crushed leaves. German infantrymen lie pressed into shallow foxholes, their rifles resting across their chests, boots caked in yesterday's mud. Behind them, the road curves back toward what the maps still label as rear areas, supply routes, reserve positions, safety. Then the ground shudders. Not ahead, not from the direction of the enemy. From behind, a single shell lands first. Short, violent, too close. Dirt rains down in choking clouds. Men lift their heads, confused, waiting for officers to shout a correction. A second impact follows, then a third, closer now, walking forward with mechanical precision. The sound is unmistakable. Allied artillery, heavy caliber, well registered. Panic ripples through the line. Someone yells that the guns must be misfiring. Another swears the Americans are already past them. Maps are unfolded in shaking hands, but the terrain no longer matches the ink. The rear, once a place of order, has turned lethal. In that moment, German soldiers realize something has gone terribly wrong. The war has slipped behind them, and the artillery has followed. By the summer of 1944, the German army in Western Europe was fighting a war it no longer recognized. For 4 years, German doctrine had been built on movement, initiative, and control. The early campaigns in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union had taught German commanders that speed shattered enemies faster than firepower alone. Artillery, in this system, was deliberate and hierarchical. Guns were assigned to divisions. Fire missions climbed a ladder of permission. Batteries waited for orders that traveled slowly, often by wire. The system worked when the front moved forward and the rear stayed behind. Normandy broke that logic. After the Allied landings on June 6, 1944, German forces found themselves trapped in a narrow strip of countryside that denied visibility and punished movement. The bocage, thick hedgerows layered with earth and roots, turned every field into a fortress and every road into a funnel. Tanks could not maneuver freely. Infantry advanced in fragments. Artillery observation was poor, and counter-battery fire was nearly impossible under constant Allied air patrols. Yet German commanders still believed in a stable rear. Behind the front line, supply columns crept forward at night. Artillery units dug in assuming they were safe from direct engagement. Command posts remained fixed, marked on maps that assumed yesterday's positions would still hold tomorrow. This assumption, so fundamental to German operational thinking, would prove fatal. Opposing them was an Allied force that had learned painful lessons earlier in the war. In North Africa and Italy, American and British armies had suffered from poor coordination, rigid command structures, and underused artillery. By 1944, those weaknesses had been systematically addressed. Artillery was no longer treated as a supporting arm. It had become the backbone of Allied ground combat. Guns were centralized, not fragmented. Fire direction was coordinated across corps and armies. And most importantly, artillery could be called down by men who were not standing near the guns themselves. Forward observers moved with infantry. They carried radios, maps, and authority. When they saw a target, they did not request permission, they requested fire. The difference in philosophy was stark. German artillery was positioned to support expected lines of advance or defense. Allied artillery was positioned to respond to opportunity. American field artillery units, in particular, trained relentlessly in rapid displacement. Guns fired, limbered up, moved forward, and fired again, sometimes multiple times in a single day. This leapfrogging meant artillery was often closer to the front than German intelligence believed possible. Air power deepened the imbalance. Allied fighter bombers ruled the skies from dawn to dusk, forcing German guns to hide, limiting daylight movement, and severing communication lines. German artillery officers often had no idea where their own batteries were, let alone where Allied guns might be. As the front compressed around St. Lo in July 1944, German units began to experience something new and deeply unsettling. Artillery fire that arrived faster than expected. Barges that shifted direction mid-strike. Shells that landed in places the maps said were safe. Still, many believed these were isolated incidents. Temporary confusion. Bad luck. They did not yet understand that the structure of the battlefield itself had changed. And that change was about to expose the German rear as an illusion. The transformation of Allied artillery by 1944 was not accidental. It was the product of failure, adaptation, and relentless rehearsal. Early in the war, American artillery units had struggled with coordination and speed. Inexperienced observers hesitated. Requests for fire moved slowly through command channels. Batteries operated in isolation. But unlike Germany, the Allied command structure encouraged correction rather than concealment. After-action reports were studied. Training manuals were rewritten. By the time Allied forces crossed the Channel, artillery doctrine had become one of the most refined systems on the battlefield. At the center of this system was communication. Every American infantry battalion moved with trained forward observers, officers and enlisted specialists who understood gunnery mathematics as well as terrain. They carried lightweight radios capable of reaching fire direction centers miles away. When an observer identified a target, he transmitted coordinates directly to a centralized command post. Within seconds, multiple batteries, sometimes entire battalions, could be assigned to the same mission. This was how artillery began to appear from nowhere. Fire direction centers did not ask which battery was closest. They asked which battery was ready. Guns behind hills, villages, even other units could be brought to bear on a single grid square. The shells arrived almost simultaneously, a technique known as time on target. To those on the receiving end, it felt as though dozens of guns had opened fire at once. German soldiers had no equivalent experience. Their artillery system remained decentralized and cautious. Requests traveled upward, then back down. Radios were scarce and often unreliable. When communications were cut, by bombing, by shell fire, by simple distance, batteries acted blind. In Normandy's close terrain, this blindness was constant. British artillery added another layer of pressure. Their doctrine emphasized massed fire under centralized control. Corps-level commanders could unleash hundreds of guns in coordinated barges, shifting fire in precise increments to shepherd infantry forward. German intelligence frequently underestimated British gun density, assuming such volumes were unsustainable. They were wrong. As Allied armies pushed south from the beaches, artillery did not lag behind. It led. Guns crossed beaches, rivers, and broken roads with astonishing speed. Engineers repaired bridges under fire. Crews manhandled pieces into position when vehicles failed. Ammunition flowed forward in streams that never seemed to dry. The result was a battlefield without depth. Traditionally, rear areas provided recovery. Units reorganized. Wounded were evacuated. Commanders planned. In Normandy, that separation collapsed. Allied artillery ranges overlapped so thoroughly that few places lay beyond reach. A German unit might move back a kilometer, believing it had escaped contact, only to find itself bracketed again within minutes. By late July, German field reports began to note an alarming pattern. Artillery fire appeared to originate from multiple directions. Barges struck roads thought to be secure. Command posts were destroyed without warning. Officers complained of enemy guns firing from impossible positions. What they were experiencing was not impossibility, but integration. Artillery, infantry, armor, air power, and logistics were no longer separate elements. They were parts of a single, fluid system that moved faster than German command could comprehend. When German units attempted to realign, Allied guns realigned with them, sometimes faster than the men could dig new positions. This was the invisible pressure building behind the front, a pressure that would soon turn fear into collapse. For the German infantrymen, artillery was always the most feared weapon. Rifles could be faced, tanks could be hidden from, aircraft passed overhead and moved on. Artillery stayed. In Normandy, that fear deepened into something more corrosive. Men were trained to understand fronts and rears, to trust that danger came from one direction. When shells began landing from behind, that instinct collapsed. Soldiers questioned everything, their orders, their officers, even their own sense of direction. Veterans later recalled the terror of not knowing where to run, because every direction felt exposed. Morale eroded silently. Units that had held under weeks of bombardment began to fracture when the bombardment no longer followed predictable patterns. Sleep vanished. Nerves frayed. Men flinched at every sound, unsure whether the next impact would come from the enemy they faced or the ground they believed was safe. Fear did not announce itself loudly. It showed in shaking hands, in delayed movements, in soldiers hesitating before obeying commands. By the time panic appeared openly, cohesion was already lost. What German soldiers experienced as chaos was, in reality, precision. Allied artillery units practiced rapid displacement as doctrine. A battery could fire, limber its guns, move several kilometers, and be firing again within hours. This movement often placed guns ahead of German expectations, especially when combined with infantry breakthroughs. Artillery did not wait for the front to stabilize. It advanced with it. When German units attempted to reposition, Allied observers followed. Roads, crossroads, and villages became predictable targets. Fire plans anticipated German withdrawal routes, striking them before troops arrived. To those on the ground, it felt as though artillery was already waiting. This tactic erased the concept of a safe fallback. Every movement risked immediate detection and destruction. Radios were the quiet revolution. Lightweight, reliable communication allowed Allied observers to speak directly to fire direction centers without delay. Calculations once performed at gun pits were now centralized, faster, and more accurate. Meteorological data, gun wear, and ammunition types were accounted for automatically. For German forces, whose communications often relied on field telephones vulnerable to shell fire, this disparity was devastating. When lines were cut, guns fell silent. When radios failed, coordination vanished. Meanwhile, Allied fire intensified. Technology did not merely increase lethality, it compressed time. The gap between sighting and impact shrank to moments. There was no warning, no build-up, no adjustment period. Only the sudden realization that the battlefield had turned against them. And that realization was spreading upward, toward commanders struggling to hold control. German leadership in Normandy faced a crisis that could not be solved by courage or experience alone. Commanders relied on maps, reports, and predictable front lines to make decisions. When artillery began striking from unexpected directions, those tools lost meaning. Orders sent forward arrived too late. Units reported positions that no longer existed. Battalion and regimental commanders found themselves issuing instructions based on assumptions already overturned by Allied movement. This erosion of situational awareness was devastating. Officers hesitated, fearing that any movement might expose their men to unseen guns. Counterattacks were delayed or canceled because assembly areas could not be secured. Even experienced leaders, veterans of the Eastern Front, struggled to adapt to a battlefield where the rear offered no sanctuary. Authority weakened not through disobedience, but through uncertainty. For Allied gunners, the experience was almost the inverse. Artillery crews rarely saw the enemy. They worked methodically, laying trails, adjusting sights, loading shells. Fire missions arrived over the radio in calm, precise language. Coordinates were read back. Calculations confirmed. Orders given. When shells landed, crews did not cheer. They simply prepared the next round. This discipline created an unsettling asymmetry. German soldiers faced terror and confusion, while Allied gunners experienced routine. The emotional distance allowed sustained fire without hesitation. As long as ammunition arrived and radios functioned, the guns would speak. Behind each barrage was not rage or improvisation, but process. Artillery inflicted damage beyond the physical. Being shelled without seeing the enemy stripped soldiers of agency. There was no opponent to confront, no position to overrun. Survival depended on luck and timing. Over time, this eroded the belief that skill or bravery mattered. German soldiers wrote of feeling hunted by an unseen force. The idea that danger could come from behind, without warning, deepened this sense of helplessness. War became something that happened to them, rather than something they fought. By late July 1944, this psychological pressure had accumulated to a breaking point. Units still held the line, but only barely. The structure remained. The spirit did not. And then came the moment when surprise became undeniable, when artillery did not merely disorient, but sealed the fate of entire formations. July 25th, 1944. Western Normandy, the field south of St. Lo. At precisely 9:38 hours, the morning sky fractures. American heavy bombers appear in disciplined formations, their engines forming a single mechanical roar that rolls across the countryside. Below them, German positions lie exposed in the narrow corridor chosen for the breakout. When the first bombs fall, the earth itself seems to buckle. Shockwaves travel through hedgerows and farm lanes, lifting men from their foxholes and tearing command wires from the ground. For nearly an hour, the bombardment continues. Roads vanish. Villages dissolve into drifting dust. Survivors cling to the ground, stunned, deafened, unsure whether the front still exists at all. This is Operation Cobra, the long-awaited Allied attempt to break free of the Norman hedgerows. But for German soldiers, the real terror begins after the bombing ends. As American infantry and armor surge forward through the shattered zone, the battlefield begins to move faster than German command can follow. Positions that were supposed to hold for days collapse in hours. Units withdraw piecemeal, guided by instinct more than orders. Maps are consulted, then discarded. Landmarks no longer match memory. Behind this advance, Allied artillery moves with relentless efficiency. Gun batteries roll forward into freshly captured ground, often before German reconnaissance can register the change. Crews unlimber their pieces beside ruined farmhouses, in orchards still smoking from the air attack, along roads the enemy had used only the night before. Ammunition trucks follow close behind. Fire direction centers re-establish within minutes, radios humming. German intelligence does not see this movement clearly. Air reconnaissance is nearly impossible under Allied fighter cover. Ground reports arrive late, if at all. The result is a fatal miscalculation. German commanders assume that artillery remains behind the original Allied lines, still adjusting, still relocating. In reality, the guns are already closer than expected. As German units attempt to pull back and reform, they begin to encounter artillery fire that no longer behaves as anticipated. Shells arrive with no ranging shots, no warning, no gradual correction. Entire salvos land simultaneously, striking with brutal precision. Roads believed to be safe erupt under steel. Assembly areas vanish seconds after troops gather. Then comes the moment that breaks certainty. A German infantry battalion, retreating through a shallow valley toward what its officers believe is a reserve area, halts briefly to reorganize. The men are exhausted, shaken by bombing and constant skirmishing. For the first time in hours, they believe they are beyond immediate danger. Helmets come off. Wounded are tended. Orders are shouted to establish a temporary perimeter. The first shell lands behind them. It explodes along the road they have just used, cutting off their retreat. At first, confusion dominates. Some assume it is friendly fire. Others believe American infantry has slipped around their flank. Then the barrage deepens. Shells begin walking forward, methodically, deliberately, bracketing the unit from rear to front. There is no mistaking the pattern. This is Allied artillery firing from positions the Germans believed impossible. Panic spreads not as a scream, but as a question. Are they already there? Officers attempt to restore order, but every movement triggers another impact. Runners sent to relay messages do not return. Radios crackle with half-formed reports before falling silent. The unit fragments, each group seeking cover in fields already churned by earlier fire. Similar scenes unfold across the sector. Retreating columns are struck along predetermined routes. Villages designated as rally points come under sudden bombardment moments after troops arrive. Command posts relocate repeatedly, only to be found again with uncanny speed. German officers begin to realize that the artillery is not reacting. It is anticipating. This realization is catastrophic. The German army relies on depth. When the front breaks, the rear absorbs the shock, reorganizes, and restores order. In Normandy, that depth has vanished. Allied artillery ranges overlap so completely that there is no clear boundary between front and rear. What was once a layered defense has become a flat, exposed surface. As daylight fades, the situation worsens. German attempts to counterattack falter before they begin. Assembly areas are shelled before units can form. Tanks are destroyed while still refueling. Ammunition dumps explode in towering columns of smoke, marking their locations for further fire. Every delay increases vulnerability. Every movement draws attention. Some German soldiers begin to believe they are encircled, even when corridors remain open. Others refuse to move at all, convinced that any relocation will draw immediate fire. Discipline erodes not through rebellion, but paralysis. American artillery does not relent. Forward observers, often operating from hastily secured hedgerows or church towers, adjust fire continuously. When German units shift, the guns follow. Fire direction centers assign new missions in seconds. Batteries rotate to prevent overheating. Ammunition expenditure reaches staggering levels, yet supply keeps pace. By the evening of July 26th, entire German formations have ceased to function as cohesive units. Communications are fractured. Commanders lose track of subordinate elements. Orders arrive that no longer match reality. In the chaos, German soldiers experience a profound psychological inversion. The direction of danger, once clear, has become meaningless. The enemy is no longer something in front of them. It is something that surrounds them, presses from all sides, and speaks through the earth itself. Artillery from behind is no longer shocking. It is expected, and that expectation signals collapse. As night falls over Normandy, fires burn unchecked. The sound of shelling continues without pause, echoing through valleys and over fields that no longer offer concealment. German troops dig in where they stand, unsure whether moving or staying still is more dangerous. The breakthrough has become irreversible. The guns have spoken, and with them, the old order of the battlefield has ended, leaving only the reckoning to come. Night does not bring relief to the German army in Normandy. It only strips away the last illusion of control. By the early hours of July 27, 1944, the battlefield south of St. Lo has lost all coherence. The front no longer resembles a line, but a scattering of isolated groups, each clinging to ground already marked by Allied fire plans. German units move in fragments, platoons without companies, companies without battalions, guided more by instinct than command. Artillery continues to fall with mechanical persistence. Allied gunners fire through the darkness, their flashes briefly illuminating hedgerows and ruined farmsteads. Sound carries farther at night, and German soldiers can hear the shells long before impact, a rising scream that offers just enough warning to inspire dread, but not enough time to escape. Impacts roll across the countryside in measured sequences, as if the land itself is being methodically erased. What terrifies the Germans most is not the volume of fire, but its certainty. Retreat routes are struck moments after columns commit to them. Roads become death traps, not because they are obvious, but because they are predictable. American fire direction centers have mapped likely withdrawal paths with cold precision. When German units attempt to move under cover of darkness, the response is immediate. Barges land without adjustment, indicating prior registration. There is no randomness, no chance. Behind the scenes, Allied artillery doctrine reveals its full power. Fire missions are no longer confined to supporting advancing infantry. They're used to shape the battlefield, blocking movement, isolating units, and destroying cohesion. Batteries are assigned overlapping zones, ensuring continuous coverage. When one battery ceases fire to resupply or cool its barrels, another takes its place. The rhythm never breaks. German commanders attempt to restore order, but they are fighting a battle already decided by speed and information. Corps headquarters struggle to establish contact with subordinate units. Radios fail or are jammed by distance and terrain. Messengers are killed en route. Maps become liabilities, showing roads and villages that no longer exist. Orders are issued based on positions reported hours earlier, positions now buried under shell fire. Some commanders attempt to improvise, ordering withdrawals toward the southeast in hopes of establishing a new defensive line. Others cling to standing orders to hold ground, fearing that unauthorized retreat will invite court-martial. The result is paralysis. Units neither attack nor withdraw effectively. They simply endure, and endurance is not enough. German artillery, once a pillar of battlefield stability, is steadily neutralized. Counter-battery fire, guided by sound ranging, flash spotting, and air observation, systematically silences guns as they reveal themselves. When German batteries attempt to relocate, they are often caught in transit, their limbers and crews exposed. Ammunition shortages worsen the situation. Supply routes are shelled before deliveries can reach the guns. Without artillery support, German infantry is left naked. American infantry advances cautiously but confidently, knowing that artillery will answer any resistance. Tanks move forward behind curtains of fire that lift precisely on schedule. When German pockets attempt to resist, they are reduced methodically, surrounded, shelled, and bypassed if necessary. 4 German soldiers on the ground. The sense of isolation becomes overwhelming. They no longer know where friendly units are. They no longer trust that orders reflect reality. Some units fight on stubbornly, clinging to training and discipline. Others disintegrate quietly, men slipping away in small groups, seeking any path out of the inferno. The psychological toll is immense. Veterans later described the sensation of being hunted by an invisible enemy, one that did not need to see them to destroy them. Artillery fire from behind becomes the ultimate symbol of that helplessness. It confirms what many already fear, that the battlefield has closed around them and escape is narrowing. By dawn, the scale of the collapse becomes undeniable. Entire regiments have ceased to function. Command structures exist on paper only. Roads are clogged with abandoned equipment, guns without crews, vehicles without fuel, weapons discarded by exhausted men. Prisoners begin to stream toward Allied lines, dazed and silent. Allied commanders recognize the moment immediately. The breakout has succeeded. The German defense in Normandy has been fatally compromised. What remains is pursuit. Artillery shifts its role once more, transitioning from breakthrough to exploitation. Fire missions move deeper, striking crossroads and bridges ahead of retreating forces. The guns do not chase blindly. They anticipate. Every mile the Germans retreat exposes new vulnerabilities, and the artillery follows step for step. For the German army, the realization is stark. The terror of artillery from behind was not an anomaly. It was the sound of operational defeat. By the end of July, the Norman front has unraveled beyond repair. What began as confusion has become collapse. What began as fear has become certainty. The rear is gone. The guns are everywhere. And the consequences of that truth are about to reshape the war in Western Europe. The morning of July 28, 1944, brought no relief to the battered German formation south of St. Lo. For weeks, they had endured constant bombardment, relentless advances, and the crushing weight of Allied superiority. Yet now, the collapse that began with the first shells landing behind their positions had spread to every level of command. Entire regiments were missing, battalions were fragmented, and the once feared German defensive lines had dissolved into chaos. The landscape bore witness to the catastrophe. Farmhouses had been reduced to splintered timbers and collapsed roofs. Hedge-lined lanes, the defining feature of Normandy, had been torn apart by artillery fire. Craters pockmarked every field, filled with stagnant water and scattered debris. Smoke from burning vehicles mingled with the morning mist, creating a ghostly tableau that German soldiers themselves later described as apocalyptic. From the air, the countryside resembled a shattered mosaic, each fragment marking the site of a failed defense or an abandoned strongpoint. German reports from the field reveal the scale of loss. The 352nd Infantry Division, a unit that had held St. Lo before Operation Cobra, was reduced to a shadow of itself within days. A battalion expected to field over 700 men could barely muster 200 effective soldiers. Weapons, ammunition, and essential supplies were lost in frantic withdrawals. Artillery units, the very instruments designed to stabilize German lines, were systematically destroyed or captured. Forward observers struggled to report, as radios had been knocked out by shell fire or overrun by advancing forces. Commanders attempted to relocate, only to discover that the ground they thought secure had already been pre-registered for Allied fire. The human toll was staggering. Survivors describe the relentless terror of being pursued not by visible infantry, but by invisible fire. Soldiers reported hearing the whistle of incoming shells and the earth exploding around them, unsure whether the danger lay ahead or behind. Exhaustion compounded the fear. Men slept only briefly, often in foxholes barely deep enough to cover themselves, while the distant but constant roar of artillery prevented any semblance of rest. Morale, already strained by weeks of intense combat, collapsed under the psychological weight of uncertainty. Small units began to disintegrate without any direct engagement with the enemy. The presence of artillery fire alone had achieved what frontal attacks could not. Commanders faced unprecedented challenges. The German command structure relied heavily on the assumption of stable terrain and reliable lines of communication. In Normandy, these assumptions failed catastrophically. Orders that were issued from divisional headquarters frequently arrived hours too late, if at all. Companies and battalions were often unaware of each other's positions, moving based on outdated intelligence. Attempts to form cohesive defensive lines were rendered impossible by the precise and relentless coordination of Allied artillery. Even senior officers, veterans of campaigns in France, Poland, and Russia, expressed frustration and disbelief in field reports, noting that the enemy seemed to anticipate their every movement. The Allies, by contrast, demonstrated the effectiveness of their integrated system. American forward observers and fire direction centers achieved levels of coordination previously unseen. Multiple batteries could target a single German column simultaneously, adjusting fire based on real-time observations. Time-on-target barges ensured that even units attempting to escape were caught by overlapping fire zones. Reports from Corps headquarters confirmed that Allied artillery inflicted more damage on German formations than direct infantry engagements in the early days of the Normandy breakout. British forces contributed additional pressure with their mass fire techniques, emphasizing coordinated barges that blocked escape routes and disrupted reorganizations. The effect was cumulative, systematic, and devastating. By July 30th, the consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. Thousands of German soldiers were taken prisoner, many of them in disorganized groups that had abandoned all cohesion. Others perished in the fields, trapped in shell craters, or unable to find cover. Artillery fire from behind had broken units long before direct combat occurred, rendering soldiers powerless in the face of a methodical and unseen enemy. The psychological devastation was profound. Letters and memoirs from the period described soldiers walking silently among destroyed vehicles and corpses, aware that the collapse of command, the relentless fire, and the lack of secure rear areas had rendered traditional tactics obsolete. The destruction of material compounded the human suffering. Entire regimental supply dumps were destroyed or captured. Ammunition, vehicles, and artillery pieces were abandoned or obliterated by pre-registered fire. Horses used for transport were killed in the chaos, leaving remaining troops with insufficient mobility. Field hospitals were overwhelmed, with wounded soldiers trapped in contested zones and medical units unable to relocate safely. Roads once used for reinforcement or evacuation became dangerous corridors, continually shelled by artillery that seemed to anticipate their use. Commanders wrote in reports that every move, even a withdrawal intended to regroup, brought inevitable loss, creating a sense of entrapment that demoralized men as effectively as any direct attack. Beyond the immediate losses, the operational implications were staggering. German commanders in Normandy realized that their ability to conduct counterattacks or organized defensive positions was severely compromised. Divisions could not hold terrain for more than a few hours, and retreating units were constantly under fire from multiple directions. Communications breakdowns meant that orders from high command could not be implemented, leaving subordinate leaders to make critical decisions in isolation. This fragmentation ensured that even units capable of resisting were rendered ineffective. Strategic cohesion had been shattered alongside tactical organization. The civilian population of Normandy, too, suffered the consequences. Villages caught between advancing and retreating forces were devastated by artillery fire, not because they were targeted intentionally, but because roads, bridges, and open fields were strategically necessary for military movement. Smoke from burning barns and vehicles darkened the skies, and fields scarred by shell craters and bomb explosions disrupted agriculture for months. Civilian casualties added to the psychological weight on German soldiers, some of whom had hoped to rely on the population for intelligence or assistance. By the end of July, the region was a landscape of destruction, with both military and civilian life irrevocably altered. Even German reports recognized the systemic nature of the defeat. Commanders acknowledged in dispatches that the enemy's artillery appears omnipresent, noting that positions considered safe are now death traps. Such language was rare in German military records, reflecting a level of anxiety and defeat that went beyond ordinary battlefield setbacks. The concept of the rear, a basic tenet of military planning, had been obliterated. Soldiers no longer trusted maps, roads, or even the positions of friendly units. The uncertainty was not temporary. It was foundational, affecting every decision, every movement, and every effort to resist. Allied evaluations further confirmed the decisive role of artillery in shaping the outcome. General Omar Bradley's after-action report highlighted that artillery fire alone disrupted enemy cohesion, leaving infantry and armored units to advance with minimal resistance. British commanders emphasized similar points, noting that coordinated barges had made large-scale German counterattacks impossible, effectively neutralizing divisions without the need for costly direct engagement. Artillery had not merely supported the offensive, it had defined it. The precision, mobility, and anticipation built into Allied fire plans created conditions that German doctrine, with its reliance on predictable fronts and rear areas, could not withstand. As July drew to a close, the cumulative effect of artillery from behind reshaped the operational landscape. German forces no longer held continuous front lines. What remained were pockets of isolated units, each attempting to survive under the constant threat of invisible fire. Retreats were conducted not as tactical maneuvers, but as desperate attempts to escape annihilation. Communications between units were sporadic and often incorrect, further accelerating the collapse. Supply lines have been severed, hospitals overwhelmed, and reinforcements unable to reach the front. The once structured German defense had become a fragmented series of reactions, each dictated by immediate threats rather than strategic planning. The psychological dimension of this collapse cannot be overstated. Soldiers reported a profound sense of disorientation and helplessness. The experience of being shelled from behind, while retreating, regrouping, or attempting to reorganize, eroded confidence and initiative. Men who had survived previous campaigns and who had fought in Italy, North Africa, and on the Eastern Front described Normandy as a place where survival depended on luck rather than skill. Letters and diaries from this period emphasized that the omnipresent artillery forced soldiers into a state of constant vigilance, anxiety, and fatigue, effectively breaking morale without a single frontal engagement in many cases. By the first week of August, the German army in Normandy had suffered losses that were both numerical and intangible. Casualty counts were enormous, but the more critical defeat lay in the collapse of cohesion, command, and morale. Artillery, moving with unprecedented speed and coordination, had reshaped the battlefield to such an extent that traditional German tactics were no longer applicable. What remained was not a fighting force, but a collection of scattered survivors, retreating under the shadow of guns that seemed to be everywhere at once. The collapse south of St. Lo demonstrates the full power of modern, integrated artillery in World War II. It was not merely a tool of destruction. It was a weapon of operational and psychological dominance. German forces, trained to fear firepower but expecting it to come from predictable directions, were unable to cope with the systemic nature of the Allied assault. Artillery had become omnipresent, precise, and anticipatory. The rear, the supposed safe haven for retreating units, was exposed, contested, and lethal. The result was an unprecedented level of tactical and operational collapse, one that would resonate throughout the remainder of the campaign in Western Europe. In the end, the price of underestimating artillery's reach and coordination was immense. Entire divisions were rendered ineffective, command structures disintegrated, and the battlefield itself was transformed into a landscape of constant peril. Soldiers survived only by improvisation, luck, and the occasional mercy of terrain. The terror of artillery from behind was not a momentary shock. It became the defining condition of the German retreat in Normandy, a vivid demonstration that in modern warfare, firepower and coordination could strike as decisively as any infantry charge. The events south of St. Lo in July 1944 reveal a fundamental truth about modern warfare. The battlefield is no longer defined by lines or positions, but by information, speed, and the invisible reach of coordinated fire. German soldiers, trained to fear the enemy at the front, discovered too late that danger could come from anywhere, even from behind. The psychological shock of artillery, moving with precision and anticipation, was as lethal as the shells themselves. Courage and discipline mattered less than the ability to survive in a world where maps no longer reflected reality. Artillery had become more than a weapon. It was a force that reshaped decision-making, morale, and movement. Every shell that landed behind German lines was a reminder that control could slip in an instant, that safety was always provisional, and that in modern war, preparation alone could not guarantee survival. The rear, once sacred, was gone. The battlefield had become a continuum of threat, where perception and reaction determined life or death. Yet amid the horror, the story also reveals the ingenuity and discipline of human organization. The Allies had learned to integrate observation, communication, and fire in ways that multiplied effectiveness without unnecessary exposure. Their system was not just destructive. It was methodical, precise, and relentlessly adaptive. For historians, the Normandy artillery campaigns offer a clear example of how technological and organizational mastery can achieve decisive results with minimal frontal engagement. Ultimately, the terror felt by German soldiers was not just a historical moment. It was a turning point in the evolution of warfare. It underscores the human cost of misjudging speed, coordination, and adaptability, and it demonstrates how the invisible power of artillery can transform fear into collapse. The lessons of Normandy echo beyond the fields of France, a reminder that in war, the most dangerous enemy is often the one you cannot see, and the most decisive weapon is the one that moves faster than your expectations.